2 hours. That is the distance between a ceasefire agreement and what several senior officials described, in background briefings, as a large-scale military operation against Iranian territory. Not days, not weeks, 2 hours. And yet, when the news broke, the markets rallied, oil dropped, anchors smiled. The headlines called it diplomacy, a win for dialogue, a moment of statesmanship. I have followed geopolitical negotiations for a long time, and I can tell you something that almost nobody in mainstream coverage is saying out loud. When two sworn adversaries reach a deal with 2 hours to spare, that is not diplomacy working. That is two actors who both needed an exit ramp, finding one at the last possible second. Those are different things, very different things. Stay with me, because what the market reaction is not pricing in, what the headlines are not telling you, is who actually won here. And the answer is going to surprise you. The U.S.-Iran relationship has operated on the edge of open conflict for over 4 decades. Every administration since 1979 has inherited a structure of maximum pressure, proxy engagement, and back-channel negotiation that rarely appears in public coverage. The mechanisms are well documented in congressional records, in declassified State Department cables, in reports from the Council on Foreign Relations and the International Crisis Group. What is almost never documented in real time is the economic logic underneath the political theater. That is what I want to show you today. This ceasefire is not a peace agreement. It is a synchronized pause, agreed to by two governments that both faced consequences they could not afford, dressed up as a diplomatic breakthrough for domestic audiences on both sides. Layer 1. The clock. The timeline itself is the first thing that should make any serious market observer uncomfortable. In formal diplomatic processes, the kind that produce durable outcomes, negotiators work for months. They establish technical working groups. They align legal frameworks. They verify enforcement mechanisms. None of that happened here in any documented public way. What we do know from reporting by Reuters and the Financial Times is that back-channel contacts between intermediaries accelerated sharply in the 72 hours before the announcement. 72 hours. That is not a negotiation. That is a crisis call. And when a crisis call produces an agreement, what you are looking at is not resolved tension. You are looking at postponed tension. Think of it this way. Imagine you have a business partner you have been in a legal dispute with for years.
One morning, your lawyer calls and says the judge set a ruling date for noon. By 10 in the morning, you have both agreed to pause the lawsuit. Did you resolve the dispute? No. You both decided that today was a bad day to lose.
Layer 2. What Iran actually needed. Iran's economy has operated under compounding pressure. The rial has lost significant purchasing power against the dollar in documented IMF and World Bank reports. Inflation, by official Iranian statistics, which tend to understate, has been running in double digits for consecutive years. Unofficial estimates place it considerably higher. The Iranian government needed one thing above everything else: for oil to keep moving. Any military escalation, even a limited one, would have triggered a round of sanctions enforcement that would have closed the remaining informal channels through which Iranian crude reaches buyers in Asia. That is not speculation. That is the documented mechanism of previous U.S. pressure campaigns, analyzed in detail by the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies.
So when you hear that Iran agreed to the ceasefire, read it as, Iran agreed that this was not the moment to find out how much more pressure it could absorb. Layer 3. What the U.S. side actually needed. The American calculus is where the mainstream coverage goes almost completely silent. A large-scale operation against Iranian infrastructure would not have happened in a vacuum. The U.S. Sixth Fleet positioning, the basing agreements with Gulf partners, the logistics chain for any sustained air campaign, all of that operates in a region where several key partners have, in documented statements to the UN and in bilateral communications, made clear that they do not want a full-scale Iran conflict. Not now. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have both spent the last 2 years diversifying their diplomatic posture. The normalization frameworks with regional actors, the investment corridors with China, these are not neutral facts. They are constraints. Any U.S. operation that destabilized those relationships would have created economic and diplomatic costs that would have landed directly on the balance sheets of Gulf Cooperation Council partners and indirectly on the energy market exposure of every institutional investor with commodity hedging in their portfolio. The 2-hour window was not Trump being close to the button. It was the structural cost of escalation being finally, clearly communicated to the relevant decision-makers. Layer 4. The oil signal that markets misread. When the ceasefire was announced, Brent crude dropped. Markets interpreted that as risk off, conflict avoided, supply stable, relax. According to analysis from Bloomberg Economics and Capital Economics, that initial move was directionally correct but analytically shallow. Here is what the drop does not account for. Iran's informal oil export infrastructure, the network of intermediaries, ship-to-ship transfers, and shadow fleet operations documented by Kepler and the EIA, does not disappear when there is a ceasefire. It continues. What a ceasefire does is reduce the political pressure on consuming countries to enforce secondary sanctions on those flows, which means the ceasefire, paradoxically, may increase the effective supply of Iranian crude to Asian markets in the short term, keeping prices suppressed even as the underlying geopolitical tension remains entirely unresolved. If you are positioned in energy equities or commodity futures, the ceasefire is not a stable signal. It is a clock without hands. You cannot tell from looking at it how much time has actually passed or how much is left. Layer 5. The domestic audience architecture. Both governments needed this to look like a win. The Iranian state media framing emphasized sovereignty preserved. No ground troops, no inspections, no capitulation on nuclear posture, at least not in the public text of the agreement. The U.S. framing emphasized strength. The credible threat of force produced the result. Both framings are partially true. That is exactly what a tactical pause looks like when both sides dress it up for domestic consumption. The pattern documented by analysts at Chatham House and the Carnegie Endowment is consistent. Agreements reached under acute crisis pressure, without underlying structural resolution, have a documented tendency to unravel within 6 to 18 months when the conditions that created the pressure shift. The 2015 JCPOA, whatever one thinks of its merits, took 2 years of sustained technical negotiation to produce. This agreement took 72 hours of back-channel calls. Those are not comparable instruments. Layer 6. The enforcement question no one is asking. Every agreement requires a verification architecture. Who monitors compliance? What constitutes a violation? What is the escalation ladder if a violation occurs? In the public text of what has been announced, according to reporting from Reuters and the Associated Press, those mechanisms are either absent or deliberately vague. Deliberately vague agreements in adversarial contexts are not a sign of trust. They are a sign that neither party was willing to accept binding constraints, which means neither party views this as a durable settlement. The clock is not ticking. The clock has no hands.
Both governments now face the same structural dilemma, just from opposite sides of the table. Iran's options: absorb the pause and use it to rebuild economic buffers, knowing the next pressure cycle will come. Political cost low, but economic risk remains high. Use the diplomatic window to advance nuclear positioning quietly. Political cost very high if detected. Or attempt to convert the pause into a more formal framework, which requires concessions neither side has publicly endorsed. The U.S. options: treat the ceasefire as a victory, reduce pressure, and risk losing leverage when the next crisis moment arrives. Maintain maximum pressure architecture in parallel with the ceasefire. Contradictory, but documented precedent exists. Or use the window to pursue a comprehensive framework, which requires sustained political capital and multilateral coordination that the current environment makes difficult.
In both cases, the cheapest option in the short term is the most expensive in the medium term. That is the structure of every tactical pause that has ever been mistaken for a strategic settlement.
Scenario 1. The pause holds and evolves. Both sides use the window to establish a quiet working-level channel. Partial economic normalization occurs in specific sectors. This is the most optimistic reading, and it requires political will on both sides that is not currently visible in their public postures. Scenario 2. The pause holds but nothing changes underneath. Oil flows continue through informal channels, sanctions enforcement remains selectively applied, and structural tension resets at the next provocation, a regional proxy incident, a nuclear threshold event, a domestic political shift in either country. Scenario 3. The pause breaks within 6 months. A trigger event, most likely not a deliberate escalation but an incident involving proxies or regional actors, tests the enforcement vacuum, and neither side has a mechanism to contain it. Markets would experience a sharp repricing, particularly in energy.
Scenario 4. The agreement becomes a template for a broader regional framework, drawing in Gulf partners and European actors. The most structurally durable outcome, and also the most politically complex, a timeline measured in years, not months.
If you follow markets, here is the honest translation. The ceasefire is not a green light. It is a yellow light that looks green from a distance. The risk premium embedded in energy prices did not disappear. It was deferred. Deferred risk has a way of returning faster and larger than the original version, because in the interim, market participants stop hedging for it. The institutional money that moved on the ceasefire announcement, the rotation out of energy hedges, the reduction in geopolitical risk premiums across Gulf-exposed equities, was responding to the headline, not to the structure. In 6 months, when the compliance questions resurface, or when a proxy incident tests the agreement's enforcement vacuum, those same positions will need to be rebuilt, quickly. And that repricing, when it comes, tends not to be orderly.
The sophisticated read on this moment is not relief. It is a quiet, calibrated form of skepticism, and a disciplined watch on the enforcement signals that mainstream coverage is not tracking.
Let me bring this together. The U.S.-Iran ceasefire happened 2 hours before a major military operation was reportedly set to begin. Both sides reached the agreement not because the underlying conflict was resolved, but because both calculated that escalation carried costs they could not afford in this specific moment. The economic logic on both sides, Iranian oil flow dependency, American regional partnership constraints, Gulf state diplomatic hedging, drove the outcome more than any ideological shift. The agreement lacks documented enforcement mechanisms. It was reached in 72 hours of back-channel contact. The pattern of similar crisis pressure agreements, analyzed across multiple comparable cases by institutions including Chatham House and the Carnegie Endowment, suggests a resolution window measured in months before structural tension reasserts itself. Markets price this as a resolution. History prices it as an intermission.
The question I want to leave you with is this. If the next provocation comes from a proxy actor, not from Tehran, not from Washington, but from a regional force that neither side fully controls, what does the enforcement architecture of this agreement actually do? Because the answer to that question is what determines whether this ceasefire is the beginning of something or just the end of this particular episode. Think about that. And tell me in the comments, are you treating this as a resolution or as a pause?